This is a topic that comes up from time to time on some of our trips, but certainly not on all of them. Um, Trips that go through Hiroshima, for instance, it's more likely to come up as a topic. The other trips, like the traditional old one, the Nakasendo, has a very different storyline, and very seldom do topics like this pop up on it. Um, I think of my life as having been pretty mundane, ordinary. I lived through it. I'm fairly familiar with it, and so there's nothing terribly surprising or interesting about it to my way of thinking. But I have put up a picture of myself, if we haven't met, and my better half there in Kyoto. And as you can see, I did, as Giorgio said, co-found Walk Japan. I was an academic at the time, and what developed into Walk Japan was supposed to be a publishing project. Um, but it very accidentally and very fortunately turned into Walk Japan. And in the first full year of our operation in 1993, we ran 2 dates and probably brought about 50, maybe 60 people to Japan. And of course, before the pandemic in 2019, we probably brought close to 5,000. So it's very satisfying that this turned out so well, and that I became a guide rather than an academic. It's been a very good second career, and actually somewhat more interesting. I get to pontificate, but I also get to go walking through Japan, all sorts of parts of Japan. I have really enjoyed that. I've really enjoyed all of the people I've traveled with. And as you'll hear a bit later, I have lots of connections with Asia. I was there from the age of 12 until the end of school, and most of my professional life was in various parts of Asia. So returning to the United States when I retired from academia in 2008 has left me feeling somewhat like a foreigner in my own country, or what is said to be my own country, according to my passport. So where I am in the States, it's still June 2, probably June 3 for all of you, but the topic is approaching World War II. And I want to hasten to say it's not about these topics, the causes of the war, how it was conducted, or the end of the war, particularly the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I will refer to those a little bit. These are all very controversial, and I found it interesting, particularly when guiding Americans, how controversial, how touchy World War II still is. And we're now 76 years, almost 76 years after Japan surrendered in 1945. So I find that surprising for a number of reasons, which I'll refer to. It's a sensitive topic, whether you're talking about the run up to the war, the approach of war, or the actual conduct of the war, for everybody, European, American, Asian, doesn't matter. The national experiences of all of Asia and all the combatants in Asia were pretty traumatic and remain quite traumatic. And of course, nationalism comes into this story. I think almost everybody feels that their nation was either offended or did the right thing. And those feelings, 75 years, 76 years later, seem no less strong than way back. And of course, their personal and family experiences. I taught for a long time in Hong Kong, and I found it very interesting that many of the students, who were 99% Hong Kong born when I got there. Um, Many of the students studying Japan, any aspect of Japan, had very positive attitudes toward Japan. But I knew their parents and their grandparents did not, by and large. They were the ones who lived through World War II in the case of the grandparents, um, as well as the revolution, and their experiences were not good. So those get passed on and inform things. But for many people, I think it's not an issue anymore because it's been addressed personally for some reason. Maybe they studied it like I did, or I mentioned here Robert Yellen, who runs Yakimono Gallery, a ceramics gallery in Kyoto, and has for many, many years. Um, he married a Japanese woman, and the wedding was in Japan, so his family came to Japan. Now, his father took great pride in flying the last American combat mission in Japanese theater. And when he came to Japan, that was the first time he had actually visited Japan for the wedding. Um, he was pretty uncertain. And he was doubly uncertain because he found out that the bride's father had been a Japanese pilot. Oh, that could have been very fraught. Well, fortunately, they met, they hit it off, and had a great time. So for him and for Robert Yellen's father-in-law, they had a meeting, they had a catharsis, they set whatever could have been unpleasant aside and behind them and got well beyond it. In my own case, I studied Japanese studies. I must have had some affinity for it, but that was not a given. My family, going back to the 1860s, had roots in China, missionary roots. Um, my grandfather Stanley was born there. My parents were both born and brought up in China and returned to China after university years in 1937, late 1937, which was not a very good time to arrive in Japan. They were located in Beijing, eventually met, got married, and then got stuck in Beijing in December 1941 with the outbreak of war between Japan and the US. And eventually they were interned in a civilian internment camp. Their experience wasn't horrible, couldn't have been terribly horrible. Nutrition was a bit low, but hey, they were able to conceive me, so they weren't starving to death. But they came away with no fondness toward Japan. 10 years later, my father was offered a choice, a position in Asia. He was a diplomat, and he was an East Asian specialist. So a position in Africa was kind of dead end, or a position in Kobe, Japan, in the land of their imprisoners. I think my parents did a lot of talks behind my back and behind my brother's back, but they eventually decided to take that position in Japan. And after 1 year, they discovered they were enjoying it so much that they signed up for another tour. In the end, they stayed 5.5 years until I finished high school. And obviously that had an effect on me. I went off to university as a mathematics major, and when I gave that up, I turned immediately toward history and Asian history in particular. So for me, the fact that my parents dealt with their history with Japan made a big difference. For some, it's a continuing issue. And I've listed 3 websites here. The last 2 are Japanese. The Center for Tokyo Air Raids is in Tokyo, but there are English language websites associated with their main website. And they actually talk about what happened in Japan. There are very few instances where you find this kind of thing. Mostly it's just set aside and not dealt with. Certainly not dealt with um, directly, except by academics. And academics usually talk to each other and nobody else. The first example that I have here is the Smithsonian Institution exhibit of 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. They decided to do an exhibit featuring the Enola Gay, the airplane that actually dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. They got it all renovated. And then they invited all sorts of academics to come in and formulate an exhibit talking about the technical aspects of developing the bomb, getting it ready to be used, choosing targets, and then various background reasons for why it was eventually decided to drop the bomb. These were ideas that had been floating around in academia for quite some time. So there was nothing particularly controversial in the formulating of those plans. They were put together and then they were presented to various veteran groups, as well as eventually to public media and to Congress. And big trouble, big trouble. Because some of the ideas that were presented cast doubt on the reasons that people were familiar with for the dropping of the bomb. And when I say people, I mean Americans. And veterans associations rose up in arms. They were very angry at some of the things that were in the exhibit. Congress, especially the Republicans, were very vocal in their anger. And eventually the Smithsonian and its exhibition committee began to backtrack, so much so that when the exhibit was finally put forward, there was simply the airplane and a brief statement that it dropped the first atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Everything else, all the thinking behind the decision, eventually proved to be so controversial that nothing could be talked about. That was 50 years later. Now we're 76 years later. Fortunately, because of COVID, nobody proposed a 75th anniversary of the end of the war. I doubt it would have been much less controversial. So why did Japan get into the war? It seems on the face of it, perhaps a dumb decision, because although Japan was a regional power and had won wars against both China and Russia, China and Russia at the time were very weak. And Japan was sufficiently industrialized and organized to fight a modern war. But it was definitely just a regional power, not a world power. Its economy compared to the US economy, total economic output, was about a fifth as big. So a long-term fight didn't make much sense to assume that the industrial might of Japan could overcome the industrial might of America, much less other enemies that Japan chose to go to war with. So what motivated Japan to get into this? And there are these very simplistic interpretations. Japan became a member of the fascist Axis. Italy and Germany were fighting, and so there was pressure within and without to join the fighting. There was a long history of Japanese expansionism and imperialism, going all the way back to, is it 1872? There was a squabble between Japan and Aborigines in Formosa, Taiwan. Um, and then there was gradual expansion, definition first of the Japanese home islands, and then expansion eventually into Manchuria and the various cities of China where Japan had treaty rights. Pearl Harbor attack. I think some people probably look at that from the American perspective and say, well, the Japanese decided to attack Pearl Harbor, strike one blow in the hopes maybe that the US would quit, not go to war. A quick coup de grace, as it were. Um, and then school textbooks. And Giorgio and I talked a little bit about this, but there are people who look at school textbooks for how events of the 1930s and 40s are presented. And I haven't kept up with things. It's been a long time since I looked at my high school history textbooks. But I do know that when I was in school, we never got to World War II. So whatever was in the textbooks, I never learned. We basically got up to World War One, the end of World War One, and that was it. So whatever is in the textbooks, in America anyways, doesn't go very far toward answering the questions I'd like to look at. So what I'm trying to do today is look at things from the Japanese point of view, both domestic and international. And the whole question actually arose out of a question I was asked by a Rhodes Scholar. Rhodes Scholar is a nonprofit organization that operates out of Boston, for whom we do trips. And one of the people on that asked me, what were the Japanese thinking about when they attacked Pearl Harbor, when they started fighting in China in 1937? What were they thinking about? And so I tried to answer that sort of thing by looking back at all the way back to World War One and then coming forward. One thing that did impress Japan coming out of World War One was that the nations all were forced to mobilize the biggest possible army with the most possible munitions that their economy could possibly manufacture. Mobilizing then the economy to be on an entirely 100% or hopefully 100% war footing. So consumer consumption was to the best of the government's abilities ignored, and everything that might have been produced for civilians went into the war effort, munitions, uniforms, etc. I've got mobilization up there twice. The second mobilization is supposed to read imperialism, a slight typographical error. But before I leave mobilization, Japanese authorities were increasingly thinking that the world was becoming quite dangerous, and that if Japan got into a war of some sort, it would require Japan to mobilize the population, the economy, 100%, or as close to that as they could possibly get. That's one thing coming out of the legacy of World War One. Another issue is imperialism, the one that doesn't appear here. Imperialism is quite an interesting elephant in the room, because there are at least two ways of looking at Japanese imperialism. One is to say, okay, everything from that first skirmish with Taiwanese in 1872 forward all the way to Pearl Harbor. So all the um, intrusions into China, outbreak of fighting at various times in the 1920s and 30s, and then beginning of gradually larger full-scale war in 1937. You can look at that as one continuum, one early decision by the Japanese to be imperialist, as all the European nations, including America, had been. Another way of looking at questions of imperialism, though, is to look at it in at least two different phases. The first phase, yes, beginning sometime in the late 1800s and continuing up until World War II, Japan was quite determined to take on more possessions in Okinawa to begin with, Hokkaido, Taiwan eventually, Manchuria, Port Arthur, and various former German colonies in Asia that the Japanese took during World War I. But World War I is a bit of an endpoint to that kind of really rapacious um, imperialism for Japan and for the other nations. If you look at the peace settlement to World War II, one of the points of thinking about World War I was that there were so many bilateral secret agreements between various larger and smaller powers that nobody quite knew what sort of treaties would kick in and dictate a nation's actions in any particular situation. So that when the best example, of course, is the outbreak of World War I, when Prince, what's his name, was assassinated in the Balkans. That caused various nations, including large nations like Russia, eventually Germany, England, France, to join the war because they had treaties that stipulated that they would come to the aid of country X, Y, or Z. And so in the peace settlement at the end of World War I, it was decided that kind of international system was very, very dangerous. And it would be better to have a more open system where all the countries had a seat at the table, the League of Nations, and would know pretty clearly what the various agreements among and between nations were. And they would better be able to calculate their actions. And it also brought an end to imperialism and the beginning of what I call internationalism here, but an end to the expansion of the colonial and imperial powers. That wasn't supposed to happen anymore. And you were supposed to have an international system, as I said, open agreements, but also international organizations covering quite a wide variety of human behaviors, not just diplomacy, but also, well, the World Health Organization goes back to this, the International Labor Organization goes back to this, and much more attempt to have things organized internationally, agreeably, hopefully without war. Before I go there, part of this involved disarmament. It was felt that for World War II, Many of the militaries were simply too large, and it made it too easy for countries to uh, be marginally confident that their armies, navies would prevail, would at least defend the country, if not beat up a combination of other countries. So disarmament started taking place. Armies were reduced, navies were reduced. In particular, the numbers of battleships and later cruisers in the big imperial navies, that's to say the UK, the US, Japan, France, and Italy, were all going to be reduced by mutual consent. And first of all, there was a treaty to reduce the number of battleships. Battleships were actively destroyed, decommissioned. And then later, same thing with cruisers. In the case of Japan, so far, most of this was all relatively agreeable. The end of imperialism, for instance, was agreeable on the assumption that this new internationalist system that was replacing expansion of imperial domains would protect existing possessions. As long as that happened, the Japanese were not too unhappy. But disarmament proved to be a problem because the Japanese government consulted with the Navy on what was a reasonable reduction in the Japanese number of battleships. And the Japanese Navy said that in our professional opinion, if we had a ratio of 10 battleships for the UK, 10 for the US, they have responsibilities in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. So fairly large number is reasonable. And 7 for Japan, because Japan is the regional power. And then what was it? 5 for France and Italy, I forget. If we had that 10-10-7 ratio, then we, the Japanese Navy, in our professional opinion, think that we would have a good ratio, one that would defend Japan. Well, at the conference regarding battleships, the Japanese negotiators, who were civilians from the civilian-dominated government and the foreign ministry, got the sense that the US and the UK were having secret talks behind the scenes. And the Japanese felt that if they didn't go along with what the Americans and the British proposed, they would be left out of this new system. They would be pretty much defenseless. And so when the Americans and British demanded a 10-10-6 instead of 7 ratio, the Japanese government felt they had to accept that ratio. Well, the Japanese Navy was really angry with this and began to say, oh, we're the experts here. We told you one thing, you ignored us, you're crazy, you're weak. And this kind of debate began to expand in domestic politics in Japan. The experts in the bureaucracy, the experts in the Navy, the experts in the Army began to maintain that we're the experts, and you, the civilian government, either need to take on our advice and not accept anything other than what we advise, or, and the or was not talked about, but it began to undermine the legitimacy of the civilian government. A couple of other things that are kind of useful to look at. Battle tactics, I suppose you could also, I should have called it battle training. And there are 2 elements here I'd like to touch on. The samurai ethos, or bushido, is very often talked about. There's a very famous book by a Japanese Christian called Bushido, which he wrote in English for foreigners who kept asking him, well, what's the main thing that motivates Japan? What is it that provides to the Japanese what Christianity provides to Europe, North America, Russia? And he came up with the idea that it's Bushido, the values of Bushido. Wrote this book. Well, it was ignored in Japan until it began to be translated, which didn't actually happen until 1930. So again, sort of like imperialism, if you think of Bushido, the way of the samurai, the values of the samurai, as having continuing influence on Japan and Japanese behavior all the way from, like, you date back to 1500, coming up through the Edo period, 1600 through 1860s, and then into the modern period. Then you have something sort of similar to what you have in the US with the cowboy, the image of the cowboy. Now, the cowboy really only existed in what, the 1870s and 80s, and then it existed in films of the 1950s, films I unfortunately grew up with. But they brought with them a particular set of values that actually had no existence in America, in American behavior, after the heyday of the cowboy. They were images of a past that probably never existed, that were brought forward for some purpose, well, entertainment, films, etc. Same thing with Bushido. There's a long period in which Bushido had no effect. Nobody paid any attention to it, even in parts of the Edo period. So the fact that it was revived in the 1930s bespeaks a need, particularly of the army, for something that they felt was missing. Well, what might that be? Nomonhan. Nomonhan is an area on the Manchurian Russian border. Formerly, Manchuria, of course, was controlled by the Japanese after about 1932. But there was very important large-scale skirmishing. Well, it was not a skirmish, really. It was quite large-scale fighting between Japanese troops and Soviet troops. I think it was, I always forget whether it's 1939 and 40 or 40 and 41. Anyways, in the first year of fighting, the Japanese troops did pretty well. In the second summer of fighting, they did very badly, because by then the Russians had learned a few things from the Germans, having been at war since the autumn of 1939. And the Soviets came in with so-called integrated tactics, using infantry, tanks, and artillery and air cover all together in a very coordinated way. It was tactics the Japanese knew nothing about except in theory. And the Japanese troops were quite shocked, and losses were very severe. Quite a large number of Japanese troops were so shocked they surrendered. And in the review of the fighting by the Japanese military establishment, they could have addressed the difference in tactics and the different levels and sophistication of air power and artillery power and tank power. Um, but the fact was that the Japanese industrial establishment could not produce very many of all of those things. And so instead, in their review of the defeat at Nomo and Hun in the second summer of fighting, the Japanese military said, well, there's a deficiency in training and in spirit. So we've got to increase the severity of training. We've got to emphasize that you never surrender, you fight to the finish. And you can see where this is going in terms of tactics. Let's look a little bit at domestic problems, the economy. Japan's economy up through World War I did extremely well. Before the war, growth rates had probably been about 8%. During the war, growth rates were even higher because anything Japan could produce, the Allies who were doing the actual fighting would buy. So the Japanese economy did very well. But after the war, they had severe problems. There was a recession, but there was also a great problem caused by exchange rates. The Japanese, like all the powers, had gone off the gold standard. And quite soon after the war ended, America, Britain, etc., went back on the gold standard. But Japan didn't want to do that because inflation had increased Japanese prices so much that if they went back on the old gold standards, the old exchange rates to the pound and the dollar, Japanese products simply would not be saleable and the economy would have collapsed. So 8-9 years later, the same problem was plaguing the Japanese economy. And there's a great political question. How do we deal with this? And the experts, and again, I like this part of the discussion, the experts in the civilian ministries more and more began to say, well, you politicians, you don't know how to deal with this problem. We know how to deal with this problem, but you're not listening to us. And the extension of that kind of thinking is that you, the politicians, are not legitimate. You're not qualified to lead Japan. We, the bureaucrats, should. But during this period, Japan's economy did become more and more heavily industrialized. The first integrated iron and steel plant was built with heavy government subsidy in about 1896. It did not become profitable until World War I, but it remained profitable and was very important for the wider Japanese economy. But more and more heavier forms of industry were being developed, chemical, electrical, etc. Consequently, the role and importance of large corporations, the zaibatsu, grew. Their political power grew tremendously. It had always been fairly pronounced, but it grew even more and becomes a problem because increasingly they're seen as having too much power and paying attention to their own bottom line rather than what the nation needs. So again, going back to the experts in the civilian bureaucracies who increasingly were trying to make economic plans, they began to see the zaibatsu based in Japan as being part of the problem that they were trying to deal with. And there was more and more criticism of the legitimacy and the role of the zaibatsu. And then there's the Great Depression. Japan finally did go back on the gold standard, and that did provoke the predicted recession, in fact, depression, in very, very short order. They did this in late 1927. And of course, about a year later, the Great Depression started with the crash on Wall Street. And Japan suffered a double whammy, really a double depression. Their own first depression induced by the going back on the gold standard, and then the world depression. There's sort of good news for Japan, however, because the Japanese army plotted in 1932 to cause an incident in Manchuria, which resulted in a fairly large-scale war in Manchuria, and the Japanese army took over all of Manchuria. But that left the government back in Tokyo having to face a problem of what to do. And one of the problems was that the army needed more weapons, more munitions, more troops. And so the Japanese government, however reluctantly or not, provided those. And the result was a tremendous stimulus, government spending on a large scale for expansion in Manchuria. So domestic politics, let me try and hurry up here. Yes. This business of generalist political parties versus competent specialists, be they civilian bureaucrats, the Army, or the Navy. The more these two groups struggled for dominance in planning and policy, the more the specialists began to exert more influence, more pressure. So much so that in the early 1930s, there were a number of assassinations of political figures, cybots of figures. It was really quite brazen, but it really undercut the position of the political parties. And after 1932, domination of the cabinet went to the specialists, be they military or civilian. And the political parties began to play a very secondary role. At the same time, there's this argument going on in the world. Which system is better, democratic system or an autocratic system? And if you looked at what was happening with the American or the British economy or the French economy, they were doing really badly. And social tensions were very high. Whereas in Soviet Union and increasingly in Germany, more autocratic dictatorial systems of government seem to be producing better results economically, socially, even politically. And so increasingly in Japan, people began to say, well, the democratic Anglo-Saxon style of government that we've been following for now 60 years isn't that good. Maybe we should be looking at something more autocratic. So ideas like fascism begin to gain more popularity. Ideas from the left wing, communism, socialism, democratic socialism, etc., which had grown quite strong on the back of a growing labor union movement, fell into disrepute. And a lot of government and police suppression of the left-wing ideologies went on. So just as fascist type ideas were rising in popularity, counterbalance at the other extreme of politics got squashed. So very quickly, the international context began to get quite bad from the Japanese point of view. The army had always been suspicious that Russia, which the army beat in 1904-05, would want to come back against Japan and maybe grab Manchuria, certainly try and defeat Japan, even though, of course, Russian emperor had been overthrown, and now you have this Soviet Union, but relations between first Russia and then the Soviet Union and Japan were very fraught. And the assumption of the Japanese army was that they had to prepare for war with the Soviet Union. And that meant Manchuria was very important. Manchuria had space, Manchuria had resources. Manchuria was a place where the army wanted to grow new economic concerns that, unlike the Zaibatsu, would better support the army. And then increasingly you begin to hear talk within Japan about encirclement by the ABCD powers, America, Britain, China, and the Dutch. A feeling that Japan didn't have access to markets, to resources that could only come from these areas. America was providing most of Japan's oil, for instance. Because of thinking involved in the block model, that feeling of, oh, we're beholden to America for oil, we're beholden to China for markets, left people feeling very uncertain, because in the case of Russia, Soviet Union, you had a country that was completely standalone, self-sufficient, own currency, own political system, own economic system. It didn't need to import or export very much. The British Empire, pretty much the same thing. The American Empire, pretty much the same thing. Japan didn't have that very well established, a bloc that would use things Japanese, the yen, Japanese economic production, Japanese models, didn't have a bloc that could stand alone without relying on US oil, for instance. And that left the Japanese feeling very, very uncertain. And it further encouraged specialists, the Army, the Navy, and civilian specialists in the ministries, more and more power to use against the political parties, or the former political parties, who were not interested in a bloc mentality. They were interested in trade and international relations if that would protect Japanese interests. But increasingly, they lost out to the specialists. So I hope this talk and the other talks are a little bit of a learning experience for you. I've been learning quite a bit, because for the first time, 18 months have gone by and I haven't done a trip to Japan, whether for guiding or for anything else. But on my last trips to Japan, I've been leading a relatively new trip that Giorgio has also done, the Inland Sea Odyssey. And one of the emphasis on that trip is contemporary art. And one of the artists involved is George Nakashima, who actually is Japanese American. He's now passed away, but Japanese American. He too, like my parents, was interned during World War II, since he was Japanese American. But he came out and became a very, very famous woodworker. He trained as an architect and learned from a Japanese carpenter when he was interned how to use Japanese techniques. And he set up a secondary studio in Takamatsu on the inland sea. And there's a company there that still produces his designs. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by them. They're just beautiful. So I've been learning how to copy and adapt some of his designs. So you can see I've been using black walnut, 2 pictures on the left, a little table, sort of using his design for a foot. And then the table on the right is something I designed, I suppose you could say myself a little bit, but mostly it's his design work, his joinery. And I made it not out of black walnut, but um, locust, a local tree. So I've been learning a bit too. Um, Giorgio, thank you very much. I look forward to more of these talks and learning something different.
Thank you, Tom. That was fascinating. It's always a very interesting topic. And as you mentioned, it doesn't often, it doesn't always come up on tour, but it on many tours, but it does come up on the Seto Inland Odyssey. And having this knowledge certainly helps us answer questions to our customers when they ask us on tour. Speaking of questions, I have a number of questions we would like to ask. So you mentioned the economical situation of both Japan and international of the time preceding World War II. And given that much of the resources of Japan were focused on acquiring weapons or reinforcing the military, please, what do you think was the life of ordinary people in the decades preceding World War II?
Well, I think you have to divide it into two groups. The majority, of course, were farmers out in the countryside, and the minority, but a growing proportion, were the urban dwellers. You can really think about two sectors in the Japanese economy. Actually, there are three, but two. The urban economy grew very well. That's where you had industrialization, whether it's the big zaibatsu and their heavy industry projects, or the various small shops, 50 workers, 5 workers, who were very frequently subcontractors for those big companies. They did very well, except for the short period of the Depression, 1928 roughly to really 1930 to 1932. They suffered a very short, sharp depression. And then they came out of it because all the military spending stimulated that sector of the economy, whether it's the big zaibatsu or the smaller companies, mom and pop operations. But that's not true in the rural economy, which is the majority of the population. The rural economy did very poorly. The Great Depression hit farmers' incomes very heavily because almost all farmers were involved to some extent in silk production, which provided actual money. And that silk exports flat disappeared. Nobody wanted silk stockings during the Great Depression. And so every single rural family lost an important source of actual money income. They could produce rice and they could eat rice and vegetables and they could perhaps avoid starving to death. But by this time, most rural people were locked into at least a portion of a monetary money economy. They needed money. And if they couldn't earn from silk, well, then everybody else in the rural area was trying to sell vegetables and rice, and the prices of those were quite low. So after World War I in particular, but even going back before World War I, the economy as a whole, and particularly the industrial economy, urban economy, grew at, as I said, a good 8% per year, sometimes quite a bit more. The rural economy grew, but only at a rate of 1 or 2%. So you can say that rural lives got better until silk is taken out of the equation. Got gradually better, but in comparison, urban versus rural, there's an imbalance. It got worse and worse and became very much a source of social tension. Oops, excuse me.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, as usual. And in considering that the silk industry was heavily staffed by women, that would have had a very big effect on women's life and their ability to earn money, because in those days, that was pretty much, other than prostitution, that was really all that they could do outside their rural country life. One more question. I'm collating them here. Sorry if I keep looking at somewhere else. During the war period, how much did the average or ordinary Japanese people know about what was happening in the war field?
I think information trickled back very slowly. It was very highly controlled.
Mm-hmm.
So there were newspaper people and so forth sent out to report back. But what they reported was checked out ahead of time and very heavily censored before it was published. So that the general public didn't even know it was maybe being censored. So except for people returning with stories of their own personal experiences, be it in China or Southeast Asia or wherever, the average Japanese would not have had very much direct content. So, or yeah, information about what was going on. One of my slides early on, I mentioned the Mugonkan as one of the few places in Japan that looks at the wartime experience, and this is quite interesting because it collects surviving works of students from the Tokyo University of Art, I guess it's called now, who were drafted immediately on graduation. Their courses were accelerated. They graduated early and were sent off. And being artists, they kept drawings, etc. Some of those came back to Japan. Some of them survived, although their authors very frequently didn't. And so their immediate families and maybe a few friends would have seen what they were producing. And some of the pictures are very stark. And they're on display at that museum. But that's a very small number of people who would have been informed. So I think in general, people knew very little, except that as the war progressed, it was obvious that the victories of the Navy and the victories of the Army were getting less and less distant. The battle lines were coming toward Japan, not going away. So the war wasn't going well, but not much information.
I see. And what was the reaction of the average ordinary Japanese people when they found out about what had happened in the war?
Interesting question, because unlike in Germany, the Japanese in general were never asked to learn about what happened, study what happened. And so immediately after the war, well, there was great relief that the Americans didn't come in and behave like total barbarians, just semi-barbarians. There was great relief there, but there was great concern about the next meal, how they were going to get through the next few days, weeks, what they were going to do when members of the family returned from abroad, assuming they would return, hopefully they would return. What do you do with the extra mouths to feed? So many of these questions that you're essentially asking about were not addressed. So much so that, you know, my own personal experience when I was studying in Japan, beginning in 1971, I was fortunate enough to board with a family, and that was very interesting because in the first couple of weeks, we talked about the war, and they said, well, you're the first American we've ever met, except for one Japanese American who came and looked at our house with a view to quartering American officers in it. And he said, no, totally inappropriate. It's much too Japanese style. Americans would destroy it. So they didn't have Americans stationed there, and they never met any until me. And one of our early discussions was, well, what about during the war? And I found out that older brother of the father of the house had been killed in the war very early. He had been drafted and served as a truck driver in China. And I said, oh, that's interesting. My parents were there and were stuck into a civilian internment camp. And we didn't talk about that again for about 3 months. And then we got to know each other enough to talk some more about that. So I think in general, people simply didn't talk about it, or they would talk amongst very small groups of friends, family, or sometimes veterans or organizations about shared experiences.
I see.
But not very public.
That makes sense. It's in line with the Japanese cultural approach on things, on not disrupting social harmony. These are difficult, they can be very difficult conversations to have, and so they're probably easier. It's probably easier not to have them, or as you say, to have them with a very close circle of friends. We're going to ask a different question now. Someone's asking, to what extent did the US oil embargo lead to Pearl Harbor at the end of 41?
I think if you ask an American, they would probably not know that oil had been embargoed, or that the US was Japan's main supplier. And I forget how main, whether it was 70%, 80%. Likewise, there was an embargo a little bit earlier on steel and scrap steel and iron, which is very important for Japanese production. I think most Americans don't know anything about that. And the only thing they know, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, is that suddenly, for no apparent reason, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Full stop. And you know, I've talked with people on Rhodes Scholar tours in particular, who have had that attitude. I've learned that, unlike this presentation, I have to be a little bit careful approaching these kinds of questions. And sorry, to go back to the that Smithsonian Institution presentation. One of the sorts of things people brought up to include in the exhibition was exactly this sort of thing. Background to the atomic bombing. Yes, it's Pearl Harbor. Background to that is the oil embargo and the embargo on steel and iron, um, which implies that the U.S. has a degree of culpability. And that didn't go down well with veterans and with Congress.
Thank you, Tom. It's almost time, but maybe we can ask a couple more questions. So, during your talk, you mentioned the relationship between Japan, China, Japan, Russia, Japan, and the US, and the politics of Japan, militant politics of Japan that led to the events that culminated with the bombing and the end of World War II. Maybe we can look at the current political landscape and think about what are the what the situation is like now, and if there are any connections between the northern and the southern territories of Japan and what's happening up there and down there.
Absolutely. There are connections and also connections with issues like educational system and apologies for the war and so forth. But from the Japanese point of view, there is one unresolved or not satisfactorily resolved issue, and that's the issue of the northern territories. The Japanese, after Russo-Japanese War, took over half of Sakhalin and all the little islands that lay between Sakhalin and Hokkaido. And after World War II, Japan returned its half of Sakhalin to Soviet Union, and also gave up the Kuril Islands. Now the problem is that the Russians quickly moved in and took all the islands down to Hokkaido, and a couple of those islands are within view of Hokkaido, so it came very close. The Japanese understanding was the southern 4 of those islands were to remain with Japan, and so that is actually a continuing issue to the extent that a peace treaty between first Soviet Union and now Russia has not been signed by either party, pending the resolution of that of the Northern Territories issue, and that has hampered not just diplomatic relations but also economic relations that could be a lot closer, particularly up in that area, to both countries' benefit. But that hasn't happened. The other issue, of course, is down south, as you mentioned, and the Senkaku Islands, Daimuto in Cantonese, are currently disputed by, well, most particularly the PRC in Japan, but also Taiwan gets in there occasionally. The area is a rich fishing grounds. It is potentially economically important for raw materials and so forth, as well as navigation rights and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So at the moment, Japan owns the area. China is increasingly, well, from time to time anyways, sending flights, sending ships and fishing boats into the area, much to the annoyance of the Japanese. Japan probably made a bit of a mistake because the Senkaku Islands themselves were privately owned.
Yeah.
And have now been bought, is it by Tokyo?
I think so, yes. Recently bought by
Tokyo Prefecture, not quite the national government, but that has allowed the issue, the tensions, to be raised very much at the national level. And that's worrisome. That's very worrisome because it, of course, it involves not just Japan and China, but also the US. What
of course. because if
US,
anything should happen, the
the
US would
US,
have to support.
yeah, would the US include the Senkakus in definition of Japan and what the US is obliged to help protect? It's
Thank you.
that's probably a more severe issue than the Kuril Islands.
Yeah, the Kuril Islands in the north, I think they kind of live there, and there are people living there, so it's probably less of an issue. The interesting thing is that for those Russians who live there, they essentially live in Japan. So they and I read somewhere that they don't need a passport to travel around Japan, because if they were asked to produce a passport, it would be implicitly accepting that the land that they come from isn't Japan. So it's a very complex and very interesting topic there. But we are really quite well out of time. Is we should say it's 11:15. One of our attendees today is telling us that there's a great carpentry museum in Kobe near Shin-Kobe Station. So if and when, not if, but when you're able to come back to Japan, let's go to Kobe and visit this museum. I certainly will make my way to Ueda and see the Museum of the Fallen Artists. We could talk about Isamu Noguchi and so many other artists who have been affected by the war and because they were Japanese and American, but unfortunately we don't have so much time. But perhaps this can give us some ideas on the topics that we can talk about in our next talks, perhaps something about architecture or and so on. And if we move to the next slide, Tom, please. I want to remind everyone that, oh, the next, sorry. That's it. So we will be advertising all our future events on our Instagram and Facebook page. And again, we will try to have them at different times of the day so that we can accommodate everyone of our extended family across the globe. That's all for us today. Thank you so much for participating. It's nice to see you all. We have a comment from someone seemed very interesting. Thank you very much for your comment. It's reassuring. One thing I may have mentioned at the beginning is that we'll be sending a short survey. Please take the time to help us understand what it is that you want us to talk about, and we will make our best effort to accommodate. Thanks everyone again, and see you soon on Walk Japan, Talk Japan.